Welcome. Impact and risk assessments are the backbone of any environmental impact assessment. Without the opportunity to identify, predict and evaluate the impacts that alternative activities, technologies or sites would have on environmental aspects, it would not be possible to pursue the best practicable environmental option that achieves our constitutional right to have the environment protected through sustainable development. So in this video, we do our best to interpret the requirements for an impact and risk assessment using the EIA regulations of 2014. Welcome. My name is Sean McGregor of Ecolegus Environmental Consultants based in Mpumalanga and Limpopo, South Africa. And we're on a mission to empower all South Africans to protect their environment through the correct interpretation and application of our environmental legislation. So if you want to learn how our environmental law applies to you, if you want to avoid costly mistakes, if you want to increase your knowledge and skills to reduce your reliance on external consultants, if you're in need of mentorship, or you just want to earn CPD points for a professional registration, then you'll want to watch these videos. If you do know of anyone else who can benefit from these educational videos, please help spread the message by liking them. Thank you. The title of this video is How to Do an Impact and Risk Assessment. Our source of information is the amended EIA regulations of 2014, as well as Series 5 of the Integrated Environmental Management Information Series, entitled Impact Significance, issued by the Department of Environmental and Tourism in 2002. I'll include a link to both of these documents in the description below. Please be warned that this is our interpretation of how an impact and risk assessment should be done within the expectations provided by the provisions of NEMA. It is not necessarily how it has to be done, and certainly does not take the place of legal advice in any situation governed by legislation. To our knowledge, there is no legally prescribed or formally adopted methodology or even a South African consensus with regards to the determination of impact significance. And that is why Appendix 1, Section 31H6 of the EIA regulations requires that the environmental assessment practitioner describes the methodology used in determining and ranking the nature, significance, consequences, extent, duration, and probability of potential environmental impacts and risks associated with the alternatives. Before I proceed further, I just want to touch on these two terms, impacts versus risks. Until we are told otherwise by the department, we assess impacts and risks using the same methodology. It is our opinion that a risk is nothing more than a potential impact, specifically designed or meant to encourage people to think beyond the obvious impacts and take into account 1. Variable driving forces, and 2. Uncertain outcomes, to identify indirect or potential impacts so that specific actions can be taken in response to those risks. Some variable driving forces would include nature, human behavior, and exposure scenarios. I want to give an example of different exposure scenarios, but before I do, just know that we identify our impacts using the methodology prescribed in the ISO 14001 standard, including its definition of an environmental aspect and impact. An environmental aspect is an element of an organization's activities, products, or services that can interact with the environment. And the impact is any change to the environment as a result of that aspect. So the ISO's environmental aspect is not to be confused with the EIA regs reference to environmental aspect, which includes geographic, biologic, physical, etc. So if the activity is driving a covered coal truck on a tarred road, then the environmental aspect, or that element of the activity that can interact with the environment, is emissions to air, specifically greenhouse gases. The impact is global warming. If we change the exposure scenario to driving a covered coal truck on a dirt road, then we get additional emissions to air, including the generation of dust. And potential impacts include dust fall on vegetation adjacent to the road verge, as well as the inhalation of dust by neighbouring communities. So now can you see that we would have not have identified those two additional potential impacts or risks had we not considered alternative exposure scenarios. Then potential impacts or risks can also be defined by uncertain outcomes, specifically the nature and extent of an outcome, most often because of a lack of information, data, or understanding about, for example, stresses, responses, or distributions over space and time. So, for example, a lack of meteorological data would make it difficult to assess the effects of wind on dust emissions and how it can influence the severity of the impact. So in summary, based on whether an activity can be exposed to variable driving forces or uncertain outcomes, we then differentiate between either an impact and risk and continue with the assessment process as usual. That is until we get to the mitigations investigation, where we then adopt the legislative precautionary principle, especially in the case of risks or unknowns. So now let's finally get started with the crux of the video. One of the principal purposes of an impact and risk assessment is to identify significant impacts. So let's start with a definition of significant impact. According to the EIA regs, it means an impact that may have a notable effect on one or more aspects of the environment, or may result in non-compliance with accepted environmental quality standards, thresholds, or targets, and it goes on. But I want to stop here to discuss the implications of these two alternative statements: a notable effect on the environment versus non-compliance with standards, thresholds, and targets. I believe that we are being told there are two parts to significance or impact significance. One, an impact can be significant based on a measurable effect to the environment. And two, an impact can be significant based on a non-compliance, which is basically failure to act in accordance with some formal requirement, whether it be legislation like a law or regulation, whether it's a rule or terms of a contract, or in this case, it makes specific reference to environmental quality standards, thresholds, or targets. An example of a standard would be the general authorization for a Section 21F relating to the discharge of waste or water-containing waste into a water resource. That general authorization contains a table of wastewater limit values applicable to the discharge, with such parameters as chemical oxygen demand, pH, dissolved elements, the concentration of dissolved elements, and suspended solids. An example of a threshold would be 300 square meters in listed activity 12 of listing notice 3, relating to the clearance of indigenous vegetation in identified geographical areas. And an example of a target would be any one of the biodiversity targets for ecosystems, species, or ecological processes that critical biodiversity areas are required to meet. Our interpretation is supported by Series 5 of the Integrated Environmental Management Information Series entitled Impact Significance, which differentiates between impact magnitude and impact importance. These are essentially synonymous with those two parts identified or referred to in the EIA regs definition of significant impact. Impact magnitude relates to a notable effect on the environment, whereas impact importance can refer to non-compliance. Different formal methods for determining impact significance have been adopted internationally, but NEMA, or more specifically the EIA regs, requires that the EAP adopts a more generic approach using judgmental criteria so that they can be adapted to individual contexts. This requirement is contained in the second part of the EIA regs definition for significant impact. It continues, and is determined through rating the positive and negative effects of an impact on the environment based on criteria such as duration, magnitude, intensity, and probability of occurrence. So not only does the definition require that 4 key criteria are taken into consideration during the determination of significance, specifically duration, magnitude, intensity, and probability, but it also requires that these criteria are ranked, implying different levels of severity are determined by the EAP's judgment. In other words, significance, being an anthropocentric concept, is a value judgment, depending on 1, the nature of the impact expressed in terms of both biophysical and socioeconomic values, and 2, its acceptability to affected communities. So, it is absolutely critical in order to avoid inconsistency between the EAPs and specialists that the EAP creates and distributes, in the specialist terms of reference, a concise and clear description of the methodology used in ranking the different criteria. Specifically, the descriptors that are used to assign rankings to each criterion. These descriptors will ensure that everyone is using the same yardstick when it comes to the consideration of value judgments or significance. To summarize our interpretation of significant impact, we determine significance using 2 parallel approaches: impact magnitude and impact importance. If either one of these are found to be significant, then the impact is significant. Both approaches entail the assigning of ratings or rankings to a set or basket of predefined criteria using clearly defined value judgments or descriptors. And that leads us to the next question. Which criteria are used in determining impact magnitude, and which criteria should be used when determining impact importance? Unfortunately, this is where it gets cloudy. The EIA regulations make ad hoc reference to the criteria that it wants us to rate or rank in the risk and assessment process, effectively failing to provide any meaningful direction. So we've taken the liberty of defining and allocating the different criteria in an attempt to create a consistent and systematic approach for determining impact magnitude and impact importance. This will be covered in our part 2 for Patreons. If you aren't a member yet, then check out our membership program on Patreon. Otherwise, if you're looking for a consultant to help you with a one-off project, you are welcome to visit our website. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. I hope it has been worth your while. Check out our previous video. We explain a preliminary investigation, including site sensitivity verification before submitting an application for authorization. Next video, we explain how we incorporated POPI into our public participation process. Subscribe, click on the bell notification icon. If you know of anyone else who can benefit from these videos, like it. Thank you so much. Keep strong and God bless.